Welcome to the Let's Chew podcast presented by Gulf Food, the largest annual F&B sourcing event in the world. I'm your host, Juwaria Hirsi, bringing you compelling stories and insights to a wide range of topics in the food and drinks industry, from farming, behind the scenes, to the culinary world, and to foods we simply love to chew on. In this podcast series, we speak to people, brands, and businesses across the food and drink spectrum to find out more about why they do what they do and how, in their own way, they're championing change and shifting the future of food and drink. Trust me, there's so much more, so listen to the Let's Chew podcast on our website, gulffood.com, and subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates in food. Welcome back to another episode of the Let's Chew podcast. As always, I'm your host, Juwaria Hirsi, and on today's episode, we have serial social entrepreneur Sonalie Figueiras, who's the founder and editor-in-chief of Green Queen, which is an award-winning impact media platform advocating for social and environmental change in Hong Kong, with a mission to shift consumer behavior through inspiring and empowering original content. She's also the founder of Eco Warehouse, a sustainable packing company. Welcome to the show, Sonalie.
It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm honored.
I was really looking forward to our conversation. So let's just go into it. And if you can just tell us a little bit about your background and your journey to where you are today and why you do what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. My journey started really around health. I have a lot of chronic health issues that I didn't know how to identify or how to treat when I was younger. I just had symptoms that sort of added up to something that was unexplainable, and in the Western kind of allopathic medicine framework that I was exposed to, that my parents would bring me to the doctor, it just felt that I was always a bit shrugged off and told that it would go away. I had a lot of digestive issue symptoms and discomfort and pain. And then eventually, it took a few years, but I eventually figured out that I have endometriosis and I have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and I have insulin resistance. So these are all diseases where your body is essentially out of whack. The way the hormones in your body are not working correctly, and so your body's homeostasis is just like not happening very well. And then on top of it, with something like a Hashimoto's thyroiditis, it's an autoimmune disease. So essentially your body is sort of like hurting itself, right? Yeah. And there's a lot of inflammation and issues with immune system. And so you just don't feel very well. But it's not life-threatening per se, although obviously over decades, that kind of inflammation and discomfort is life-threatening, but it's not acutely life-threatening, right? And so there isn't sort of an injection or a medication that you can take. And at the time when I first figured out that I had these things, there really wasn't much literature about it. There weren't many studies, certainly not many studies done on women or women of color like myself, or just there wasn't a lot of information. And the doctors that I went to see, which unfortunately tended to mostly be older white males, whether this was in the US or even in Hong Kong or in London, where different places where I lived or my parents were living, it just never felt like anyone was listening. And I just felt very helpless. And around this time, I'd been in university and Google had really come out, and I started to go crazy using Google to do research, which is so funny because we're in the middle of this like kind of chat GPT revolution, right? Where people are asking chat GPT all kinds of questions. And I wonder what would have happened if I had used it for a medical reason. But I did a ton of research and I found all these, esoteric papers or this medical research around my conditions. And it seemed like possibly using diet to treat the symptoms could be helpful. And so that's what really led me to examining my food culture really around, especially around nutrition and health. Because I had a very healthy food culture, I think, growing up, where we ate a lot of homemade food. My mom's an amazing cook. My grandmother's an amazing cook. Food, food is life in our house. It's all about like the meals and sharing those moments and coming up with new recipes and discovering new places to eat. And so, and it always felt very healthy because it was homemade, in the sense,
Yeah.
my mom was always like, okay, you want a cookie, I'll make it for you. Just don't buy it. But it ended up going beyond that for me into how the food was grown. And I had never been confronted with any of those issues around agriculture, around pesticide use, around whether the soil was depleted from nutrients, and whether, water pollution was affecting the food that I was eating, and the hormones and the antibiotics in the animal meats that I grew up eating, and the dairy products that I grew up consuming, and all of this kind of, all these topics that felt very important, and yet no teacher had ever mentioned it, no parent had ever mentioned it, no doctor or medical professional had ever mentioned it. And that just felt really wrong to me. And then I got into, okay, well, it's not just the foods I eat, but it's, the shampoo on my head and the spray I'm using to clean my kitchen counters. And so I ended up having this kind of eco awakening, and I completely changed my life. And that's also where I stopped using plastic, because originally, today, I think plastic is much more associated with, and rightly so, with environmental waste. But 20 years ago, there was a lot of chatter in kind of niche health communities around plastic and hormone disruption. And it's very likely that my excessive exposure to plastics growing up has worsened my hormone conditions, which are both related to disruption. And so I really changed my life and found it difficult to live that life, right? Because first of all, I was definitely in a city where a lot of this culture and these sub-niche groups of extreme health and organic food and all that were really just at the beginning, if existed at all. And so I had trouble finding information. And I had trouble finding products, and I had trouble connecting with, organic farmers and such and such. But I mean, this is a long time ago. It's a completely different situation today. So I just want to be very clear about that.
Yeah.
But as a result, I started seeking people out, right? So chefs, wellness professionals, nutritionists, scientists and researchers around agriculture and around toxicity. And that led me to NGOs that were working on some of these issues. And that's really, the more I dug, the more I made this connection between food systems and the climate. And the more I realized that our health and the health of the planet are intertwined. And somehow, even to this day, I find it's very separate. I find you've got people that are very into health, and then you've got people that are very into environment. But it's not usually overlap. Whereas at Green Queen, we've always overlapped it. And that's because I felt very strongly that there was this kind of holistic view that needed to be taken. And so, because I was meeting all these interesting people, and I've always been a news junkie, and if I look back, I did actually have journalistic instincts since I was a young kid. I've started magazines. I was the editor in my high school paper. So there were signs, even though I had never thought about it as a career. And so I decided to start this blog to kind of share information. It really started out as I've got this little green book of stuff and people and things and places that I am using to live this healthier, kinder, greener life. And maybe other people might get some use of it. But I really didn't understand at the time the power of the internet or what it meant to start a media company. I mean, I don't think I even started a Facebook page. It was really just like a typical WordPress blog. I found a designer online. I had come up with this Green Queen name in a dream. That is a true story. And she made me this logo, and originally it was pink and green with a crown, and off I went, knowing nothing. And it really just, it resonated with people very early. And very quickly, I started to have people realize that people were reading it, started to send a newsletter, started an Instagram and Facebook page, started doing events. People started asking me to speak. That's another thing. I really never planned on becoming a speaker. And then suddenly it was like, in a few years, it was like 50 events a year. It really got, I felt like I became the person that people would turn to if they wanted a speaker in Asia around, future of food, climate, sustainability, etc. As my journey went on, I really started to see the damage of industrial agriculture on a climate level. And then I started, making decisions to reduce animal foods in my diet. There were also ethical reasons. For example, I stopped eating shellfish like prawns and shrimp very, very early on because of slavery and exploitation, supply chain issues, and it just went from there. And then it just became, and then I got a dog, I remember, and that really changed my relationship to animals and eating them. And why would one be a pet and one be a food? And it all started to just, I wanted to live a lower footprint life, not just carbon footprint, but just moral footprint and ethical footprint and all kinds of things. So I, like, little by little was reducing animal foods. And then I decided to make our media the first one in Asia to say, okay, we're not going to cover animal foods. We're no longer going to cover restaurants or products. Because originally we would talk about, grass-fed meat or pasture-raised eggs or organic dairy, but we turned that off. We were like, you know what? There's tons of other media out there that cover all that stuff. We're going to stick to another vision of the future, without kind of saying we wanted everyone to go vegan, but more just we wanted people to be inspired by a life that was maybe less focused on animal consumption. And around that time, I had started tasting products like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods because I had another business that was a food supply chain business around organic ingredients. And so I was always going to food shows like Gulf Food, right? Okay. And I would go to these food shows and I would meet producers and I would meet entrepreneurs. And I started to see this kind of burgeoning of this small group of folks that were starting to make products to replace animal proteins that they were different than what I'd seen before. They felt different. The visions felt different. The brand building around it felt different. And I remember it was in 2015 or 2016, we wrote the first article in Asia about these kind of alternative proteins, although we didn't even have that name then. And it was like, sort of, these 8 companies are going to revolutionize the future of food. And we wrote about, at the time they were called Hampton's Creek, now it's Eat Just. And we wrote about Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. And there was also New Wave Foods, which were doing the plant-based shrimp made with a seaweed. And yeah, it was really early on, but that's when the interest started. And then I just started to get more and more kind of connections around that. And we started covering it more. And right before the pandemic, I decided that I wanted Green Queen to really become a news platform, not just a lifestyle. And I wanted it to go global. And so we started covering things.
That's very
globally,
powerful.
But with an Asian lens. Because one of the things that was extremely important to me was I felt that Asia was so important to the future of food, just from a numbers point of view, right? This is where the majority of the population lives. This is where all the population growth is happening. This is where meat consumption is going up. And I felt that we needed a voice at the table. And I could see that the brands were really taking off in a very European and American way and North American way. And I wanted to make sure that we were telling the Asian stories and we were bringing in the Asian perspectives and highlighting, what was going on here.
So what is the current state of the industry right now, the plant-based industry? What are you seeing? What are the trends in Asia, let's say?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, in Asia or globally?
Globally, and then we can just focus on Asia.
Well, I think that if obviously alternative proteins is cultivated meats and seafood and dairy, and then it's precision fermentation, biomass fermentation, molecular farming, and then you've got the whole big plant-based meats and dairy and seafood, etc. So let's talk mostly about plant-based, because that's really the industry that's mostly come to market, right? Yeah. There's no cultivated meat products in retail stores. There's one country that's given approval to one company, Eat Just, for their good meat cultivated chicken, and that's being sold at select restaurants in Singapore, but that's it. Otherwise, beyond that, you can't go to the supermarket and buy cultivated products. So plant-based is really the part of alternative proteins that has captured global headlines and that consumers are somewhat aware of, right? And of course, brands like Impossible and Beyond have really dominated that story. And so I think it depends which country you go in. I think in the US, there's this kind of perception that plant-based meat is taking a bit of a beating. You know, Beyond had the most successful IPO in years in 2019, and now its stock is really underperforming, and it's just constantly being, used as an example of what's wrong with the industry. I think there's this rhetoric around plant-based meats are, over-processed, which, is sort of unfair on many levels. And then there's sort of this perception that people tried a lot of plant-based meats during the pandemic and now it's slowing down. But really what happened is the space got probably overhyped from a funding and VC point of view, and media got really excited about it. And so there was, just headline after headline, launch after launch, new funding round after new funding round all over the world. And then obviously some of the hype died down for other reasons too, like macroeconomic issues and geopolitical issues and rising inflation, rising interest rates, etc., a worsening economy globally. So the industry is experiencing a maturing, right? And it's hard to keep up that initial hype forever. And so now more people know about it. There's more market share. There's more products on the shelves. And it's true that not every product is amazing. But at the same point in time, it's an amazing success story of this whole new category of products that's broken through. And you've got, supermarkets that are making their own plant-based meat. And you've got restaurants that are making sure they have a plant-based meat option on their menus. And you've got, believe it or not, over 1,000 different plant-based meat brands across the world. So it's sometimes a bit reductive in the media in the sense of just looking at Impossible or Beyond and judging everybody on
that lens.
2 companies, right? When there's literally 1,000 companies and they're all using different ingredients and have different types of products and formats and brand experiences. And so it's really changed. I think the world has changed because of the advent of plant-based meat 2.0. And of course, being in Asia, we know there's always been what we used to call here mock meats, right? Made out of gluten or seitan or different kinds of tofu and soy products. And they're still around and they're still great. But here we went to a point where you had a company like Impossible Foods that was studying ground meat and how it was made and sort of thinking, how can we engineer plants to taste exactly like animal ground meat, And so that was just like a different approach to looking at how to create these products. And I think it's been extremely successful, but I think it's going to be a more difficult year for plant-based meats overall, just because I think a lot of venture capitalist funds, the ones who are dedicated to this industry, like the alt protein funds, they're going to stick around. But generalist VCs have decided to, maybe just, I guess, sit tight before they invest more, because valuations are coming down, and it's just been more challenging business environment. So overall,
how are consumers we know the company's investment space, but what about consumers' behavior? How are consumers reacting to the future or alt protein? How are they reacting to that?
Well, I mean, like anything, I don't think consumers are a homogenous group. I think you have you know, very, very dedicated vegans who have ethical reasons for wanting to choose these products. I think you have flexitarian consumers, which I see as a really important and growing base, who are looking to have variety in their diet and reduce animal products, mostly for environmental reasons. And so they're looking to trial and discover new foods, right?
Yeah.
And then you definitely also have consumers that are a little bit more maybe just hesitant. Maybe they're an older demographic, or they're just more old-fashioned as people, and they are very, very committed to, you know, animal foods as part of their identity, and so that's a harder sell. But in general, you could make the argument that, you know, the younger a person is, the more open they are to these alternatives. A lot of times there's also a health argument, and that's what we see a lot in Asia.
Okay.
Is that in Asia, you have this understanding that too much meat is unhealthy. And so a lot of the products here and the brands here are basically, they speak more about things like cholesterol free or saturated fat free or that kind of angle, right? Maybe it's not necessarily the environmental angle as much. I've just been writing a few articles around, you know, why Asian consumers are quite different. And I talked a lot about this idea of the happy cow myth that I've coined, where it's basically, you know, a lot of my European friends and even myself being half French, you have this kind of happy cow myth that you grew up with, where these white cows with black spots that are like happily in a field, and it's a beautiful green field, and they're just like, you know, chewing on their grass. And that's where we get our milk from, you know? And I think that if you grew up in Asia, you don't really have that happy cow myth as part of your childhood story and your connection with dairy products. And so you're not as, you know, you likely do not have a dairy farmer in your family tree. Whereas I feel like a lot of Europeans and Americans that I know have some kind of farmer, and maybe even a dairy farmer in their family tree. And so it's a very different relationship to dairy as an industry.
Yeah. And you mentioned the environmental impact, and we're facing the biggest threat of our generation, which is climate change. Can you just shed some light on the link between climate change and what we eat, and ways that we can combat the climate change through food?
Sure. So the thing is that because of our industrialized food system, which we moved to an industrialized food system so that we could make food production more efficient, and so that we could feed more people and also make it more affordable. And in the past, you know, we've reckoned with things like mass hunger and mass nutrient deficiencies. And so the idea was to industrialize the food system to really fight those issues. In the end, though, what we've ended up with is a system where we are, right now, the amount of industrially produced meat and dairy that is consumed by the average US citizen, right? If everyone in the world started eating like that, we would need 5 to 7 planets, because it takes up so much land, it takes up so much water, it takes up so many antibiotics and hormones, right?
Yeah.
And what we're doing is that we need to create feed for those cows. So we're growing soybean and corn to feed those cows, which in itself is problematic because cows are meant to eat grass. But in order to make the process more efficient, we fatten them up by feeding them grain. Of course, that's not their diet of choice, so then they get more sick. So we have to give them things like antibiotics, right? And essentially growing a cow to create protein for us to eat is totally inefficient. So we found ways to make it more efficient, but those ways are damaging to the environment and to our health. And what a lot of people don't realize is that, if you look at the total carbon budget of the planet, the food industry is almost a third of that.
That's true.
And the livestock industry, so beef to create dairy, and so cows to create dairy and beef, is between 14 and 18% of global greenhouse emissions. Cows also they release methane, right, in the form of gas, farts, and that methane actually is it's even worse than carbon for global warming. It exacerbates global warming more. So that's another argument for it. Raising cows is also very, very dirty business in terms of water and diseases. So what ends up happening is areas that surround slaughterhouses and cow farms are actually quite toxic. It's also a very unpleasant industry for the workers. We rely on, undocumented, very, very cheap labor in many places to produce this industrial dairy. It's basically a system that exists for us to get really, really cheap meat.
So how can we combat these issues and tackle climate change? Obviously it's not overnight, but what are some steps or slow steps that we can take?
Well, first of all, we need consumers to understand that there is a connection, right? And that what's really important to understand is that we never used to eat this much meat, but now we eat way too much meat. We don't need to eat beef 3 times a day, or even twice a day, or even every day, right? Animal protein used to be something very valuable and scarce that we only ate once in a while. And now we eat it, it's everywhere, and it's cheap, and it's just, we're addicted to it. And it's also bad for our health, for us to eat so much meat. So I think the first thing we need to do is really spend a lot of time educating and informing people around reducing meat consumption. The second thing we need to do is offer people alternatives, which is what alternative protein companies are trying to do. And the third thing that we really need to work on is around working to kind of fix some of the issues in the industry, like reducing antibiotic usage, right? And having regulations so that, cows have to eat their natural diet for most of the year, and, reducing not cutting down Amazonian forest in order to grow soybeans to feed cows, because that's really what's also terrible, is that we are bringing upon even more industrial environmental destruction, because we have, in the Amazon, for example, it's reduced its size by more than 50% in order to raise soybeans and to have grass, to have pasture land for cows, because of our crazy appetite for beef. So, and the problem is, tropical forests like the Amazon are huge carbon sinks that help to combat the effects of global warming. And now we're cutting down those very carbon sinks, the trees in the Amazon, just so we can eat meat. And the problem is, the more we make meat cheap and the more we make people addicted to meat, then the more people want to eat meat. And we cannot get to the point where we've just cut down every tree in the world so that we can grow more cows, So we really have to start thinking about how can we eat in a way that is, more at peace with and at harmony with, a planet that is going to have to face quite extreme consequences of the climate crisis.
So do you think it's enough for just media and companies to be pushing this agenda, or do you think governments should also push this?
I think I honestly don't know if we can meet the targets without government action. I think we need to seriously consider policy around diet, in the same way that governments are considering policy around sugar consumption, right? In the same way that we have government policy around electric vehicles, right?
Yeah.
And renewable energy. We need to get to the point where the government is looking at the food system in the same way that they're looking at all the other industries, and that they're looking at the toxicity, the pollution track record, the emissions track record, and going, okay, we're implementing changes to this so that individuals are guided on how to make different choices. So yeah, I think businesses need to change. I think individuals need more help and information and access to resources so they could change. But without major government policy change, it's hard to get companies to really change, right? Imagine if you had to pay the true cost of meat, including like the cost of all the antibiotics that are used in the meat industry and what that's done to cause superbug resistance. So our antibiotics are no longer working on us because we've got too many antibiotics in our system because we're eating all this industrial meat, right? And what about if meat companies had to pay for the water, the rivers, and the lakes that they pollute? What if they had to pay actual living wages to meat workers? You know, what if they only could feed cows grass, which is what cows are supposed to eat? What if they weren't allowed to cut down any more trees? So what happens if you put in all the restrictions of what it should look like?
I think then there's an impact.
Right, but because big meat is so powerful, big food, big meat, it's really, really, it's impossible and they're not going to give up their profits. That's really the problem.
True. So when you're doing these research in comparison to other regions, what can we learn from the Asia's plant-based and alt protein industry?
What can we learn? Well, one of the things we can learn is that Asian companies have been very smart about localizing their product and really listening to their consumer. And so while the Impossible Burger is a hero product in the West, burgers are not the main food of Asian consumers. And Asia is not just one place. It's, you know, dozens of countries with their own food cultures and sub-food and regional food cultures. And so what is really important to understand, and I think Asian companies really understand that, is that food is so personal. Food is so linked with identity and culture and tradition and family. And you can't just show up and say, eat this instead. You really have to work with people on the ground and understand food culture and understand how you can work with local ecosystem players and local cultural touch points to shift the conversation towards a more climate-friendly way of eating. And at the end of the day, you know, most local ecosystems and people want to change towards a more climate-friendly way of eating because they know they have to, right? Because we're all affected by climate change. And actually, Asian consumers feel the effects of climate change the most. Most of the extreme weather and in the future, mass migration as a result of climate change will affect the Asian continent the most. And we're going to experience the fastest population growth of anyone. We're probably going to experience the most climate-related diseases. We're going to experience some of the most, you know, strong growth curves around animal meat consumption as we move hundreds of millions of people into the middle class. And when people get more disposable income, they tend to want more highly nutritious food, and they tend to see animal foods as part of that. So all of this is going to create a demand that we genuinely cannot meet. One of the things I talk about a lot is the term alternative protein is a bit of a mistake, because these are not alternative proteins. These are another type of proteins, because it's going to get to the point where even if we keep producing all the animal foods we produce today, we won't have enough for the demand. So we're going to need alternatives anyway. We're going to need additional options. So I think one needs to think that way. I also think it's such an amazing opportunity to create foods that are even more nutritious. Right?
Yeah.
I think the lessons we can learn is health is really important. It's what motivates most Asian consumers around plant-based foods. Localizing a product is really important, and understanding who your audience is and making sure that the food fits in their cultural food tradition. Right?
Yeah.
Those are
So
really important lessons that I think Asian brands in this space really understand well.
that's very interesting. And you also run a sustainable company. So, in terms of sustainability, what behavioral changes or shifts do you see among consumers? And if you have any advice for a business or individual like me who's just trying to become more sustainable, what would that be?
I think for businesses, it's really important to look into the future and go, am I a climate resilient business? Can I keep producing the products and services that I do today in 10 years? What happens if the more extreme consequences of climate change come true? Is my business protected against that? And I think it's really important to have at least one person, if not a team of people, that are getting the company ready for a future where climate issues will be dominant. And climate issues being dominant means food security problems, food supply chain disruptions. COVID, you could think of it as a bit of a preview for what we're going to live through, except it's going to be more permanent.
That's scary.
It is scary. And so that's why it's really important to go in with your eyes wide open as a company. As a consumer, I think I try to think about, what can I do on a daily basis that helps me have a more climate conscious life? If I can't go vegan, can I just reduce my meat? Can I explore new recipes? Can I use it as an opportunity to, maybe I say to my friends, hey, let's start a, Tuesday green dinner club. And like, we either do like a potluck together where everyone brings a meatless dish, or we agree to try a new restaurant that a different one every week that is offering, non-meat options. I think there's ways to make it fun, to make it a community thing, to see what it's like to consider these issues in a world that is really going to be beset with them.
That's really true. This is very controversial, but what specific trends do you think that we need to just discard, no longer is serving a purpose? Any plant-based terms or just anything that's overhyped? What do you think?
You mean specifically within
the plant-based industry or veganism or just
okay.
a recipe? It could be
what I think we need to discard is this idea that we need to be perfect climate conscious, vegan conscious people. I think that kind of rhetoric can sometimes alienate the average person and make them disengage with the entire conversation. When I think it's really more, it's more about respecting that everyone's at a different point in their journey and being inclusive and open and having different ways and entry points for people to come in, right? Like maybe for some people, they engage with the climate conversation through fashion. Maybe for some people it's through food. Maybe through some people it's, through energy, like the car they choose. But I think we need to be more open to little steps and little changes. Because what I know for sure, having done this for so long and met so many different people at different points in their journey, is once you start this journey, you slowly change more and more. So the really important thing is to start. If you start eating meat once a week less, you will eventually be like, interesting. I feel like I have more energy the next day. I realize that when I don't eat meat, I sleep better. I feel lighter. Okay, maybe I'm going to do it twice a week. And then maybe I'm going to do it 3 times a week. But maybe that person's never going to do it 7 days a week, but 3 times a week. If everyone did that, that's a huge shift. That's a huge change in demand and a huge impact in terms of emissions and ethical considerations and animal lives. And so, but we could have easily discouraged that very person from even starting by making them feel like it was an all or nothing. So I think the really important trend to get rid of is extreme positioning and really just working to be more inclusive and open and and giving people options and access. And the other trend I really push for is diversity. So diversity in flavor, in thought, in format, right? Really trying to engage with all kinds of people. This should not be a global North-centric or Western-centric movement. And especially since, very honestly, global North countries are richer per capita, have more resources to weather climate change, and will be, on average, less affected than the global South.
That's very interesting. And I'm truly inspired because I did try to turn vegan, like not vegan actually, I turned just vegetarian, and then I did pescatarian for a year, but then I started having more sugar cravings. So I eventually did stop, but I did reduce my meat intake for at least like 3 times a week to 2. But I still have a long way to go. But this is very inspiring. So just to switch a little bit, you're running the largest plant-based media platform. Were there any challenges you had to overcome so far, being like a female in the industry?
Oh, I still have to overcome them all the time. I'm often the token female. People think I don't know, but I do know. I'm often the only female in the room. I think even being in media, it's difficult because I think people don't even always take media as seriously as a business in terms of, getting investment and getting resources, right? Like everything's around product, when actually without the media our media helps people get funded, helps people get deals in supermarkets, helps customers learn about products, but it's really difficult for industry to see media as valuable. So that's, I think, the biggest challenge, when everyone knows it's valuable and everyone tells me that they read it and everyone needs it. But I think from making the business case for media, and this is not just true of me, and this is all media in general, we're at a point in time where media has never been more important and valuable and needed, and yet it's never been more at risk from business model point of view.
That's true. It's been really great having you. So just last words for our listeners before we wrap up the episode. What is next for you in terms of your long-term vision for yourself and for your brands?
Yeah, for me, my long-term last words is start wherever you can and don't get caught up in extremes ways of thinking. Just do whatever you can. Look at your plate, look at your life, look at your fridge and think, how can I make small choices that can have, big impacts for the climate and for a more stable food future. And then for us at Green Queen, I think my vision is really, how can I help people eat in a way that is climate resilient? That's really what I'm looking to answer as a question.
That's powerful. Thank you so much for joining us, Sonalie. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again for joining us, Sonalie. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Let's Chew podcast as much as I have. And if you did, please leave us a review. And don't forget to join us at Gulfood 2023 to engage with the entire F&B community this February from the 20th to the 24th. You can get your tickets today on our website, www.gulfood.com. See you soon and bye for now.